Like I mentioned in my countdown of the top 10 best NES soundtracks, the limitations of the hardware of the system meant that the early video game music composers working with the NES didn't have a lot to work with. Still, the music composers did what they could with it and made some absolutely beautiful pieces. Note that not all composers did this. Some gave it their all, whereas others... Well, anyway. Similar to the other list, I've limited this list to only feature one game in a series. Sorry, Mega Man. And of course, also just one track per game. I'm Tony with Let's Play with Brigands, and these are my picks for the top 10 best individual tracks on the NES. Number 10, Super Dodgeball, the All-Star Team. Like a few other picks on this list, the best track in Super Dodgeball is also the most epic track. Now I know I've made this joke and observation about a dozen times, but explain to me how the All-Star Team is the first and easiest out in Super Dodgeball. This track, like this team, should have been last. I guess the developers wanted to hit the ground running, and this track certainly pulls you into the game from the first drop of the ball. Like many of the tracks on this list, it's a very dynamic piece which rises and crescendos in all the right spots to build that feeling of tension. It feels like it would fit right in with the Double Dragon game, which is no surprise considering these games share the same developer. While there are a lot of great tracks in Super Dodgeball, this is easily my favorite. Number 9, Double Dragon, Mission 1. Speaking of the developer Technos, the Double Dragon games on the NES all had excellent soundtracks. They all had that sort of NES take on a late 80s action film score, full of epic hooks and NES chiptune elements made to emulate soaring guitar solos. This is never on display better than with the very first mission's track, throwing you headfirst into the tension of your quest from the first few notes. This track covers a lot of ground that is actually a pretty sophisticated composition. It begins with the initial establishing verses, featuring that memorable hook, and flows into a chorus which builds that tension very nicely. The first go-around just teases the best part, but after that second chorus, the track explodes into one of the best solos found on the NES as the chiptune solo takes full flight and center stage. All throughout the track, the same frenetic drum loop creates a very nice bit of energy which never allows you to come back down. It's perfectly suited to set the tone early on for one of the best beat-em-up games of all time. Number 8, Rescue Rangers, Fat Cat's Hideout. I don't think it's debatable that Capcom, on average, made the best music for the NES. Rescue Rangers is our first of many Capcom entries on this list. And while there are a lot of great tracks in this game, including Zone F, or the excellent porting of the Rescue Rangers theme song itself to chiptune, it was that final stage of Fat Cat's Hideout that remains my favorite. It has a kind of wistful vibe which hints at the danger as your quest is coming to its final conclusion. In fact, both in that sense as well as in the music itself, it kind of reminds me of the song Worthless from the penultimate junkyard scene in the underrated animated movie from the 80s, The Brave Little Toaster. And sure, it's just a quest to stop Fat Cat, whose worst crime is probably catnapping the neighbor's kitten, but the track is epic enough to make you feel like you're saving the world. Number 7, Jackie Chan's Action Kung Fu, Cave Levels. Let's keep that wistful vibe going for one more track with the music used in a few caves and other levels from Jackie Chan's Action Kung Fu, a great beat-em-up-like platformer on the NES from Hudson Soft. There's nothing especially remarkable about this track. It's just a handful of great hooks over a simple but effective minor chord progression. The hooks are presented with a nice twinkly effect, followed by longer, more drawn-out waves. The bridge of this track also builds and soars as well as any other track on the NES. I actually still play this solo myself on my guitar from time to time. It really is that good. Now it's also worth mentioning the really nice echo and reverberary effects on most of the instruments and pieces in this game, which really helps give them their own unique quality on a system where, again, you could only do so much with what you had musically. Number 6, The Legend of Zelda, Overworld theme. So a few people gave me flack for not giving The Legend of Zelda what they thought was its fair shake on my top 10 best NES soundtracks list. The thing to point out there is that the game really only has 2 tracks. The Overworld theme, which is really just a remix of the opening theme, and the dungeon theme. As good and iconic as The Legend of Zelda's music is, it gets pretty repetitive between just the two. Still, it is good and it is iconic, which is why for an individual track, I rate The Legend of Zelda's main theme at number 6 on this list of the best tracks on the NES. Most folks who grew up in the 80s or 90s know this theme so well that it's actually pretty hard to be objective regarding how good it actually is. The game is fantastic and still blows my mind what it was able to accomplish, given that it came out in 1986. But a huge part of striking the vibe and tone that the game establishes was this piece of music. And while this theme will dominate, let's say, 40% of your time playing the game, I mean, honestly, that's probably most of why everyone knows it so well and has it stuck in their heads. As repetitive and simple as it is, it never really feels like it's overworn its welcome. Number 5. Maniac Mansion, Dave's theme. Track for track, one of the strongest games on the NES, so much so that I put it at number 2 on my top 10 best NES soundtracks list. Maniac Mansion's music is so good. Sure, I might be a bit partial because all the lovely folks who have discovered this channel because of my Let's Play of the game in question, but everything about this game is excellent, including its soundtrack. And while it may feel like an uninspired choice putting Dave's theme specifically at number 1 in terms of that game, I think it truly is the best track overall in the game, and that's high praise with this specific game. Everyone else's tracks are great and excellent for switching to when you need a break from Dave's. Just don't try giving away anyone's boombox. But they all feel a bit more niche compared to Dave's. Don't get me wrong, everyone's tracks have a great identity to them, which perfectly match their owners. Wendy's track is whimsical and sweet. Bernard's is quirky and features some really nice use of reverbs. Racer's track is hard-hitting and in your face. Sid's track is cool and confident with probably the best solo of the bunch. Michael's has the best pumping beat and bass, and Jeff's always feels like a relaxed breath of fresh air. Sure, Dave's track features an epic solo, builds beautifully, and doesn't have a wasted beat in it, but most importantly, Dave's track does exactly what it should. He's the common tie which connects all of his friends to one another, and as such, his track feels like it brings everything together in this game. Quite literally an interpretation of Thin Lizzy's The Boys Are Back in Town, it feels like getting together with a bunch of your friends to do something great. Or in this case, sneak into an evil genius's mansion and rescue your girlfriend while simultaneously saving the world from a power-hungry, sentient meteor. You know, as you do. It's a track which always puts a smile on my face when I hear it, and it carries one of the best games for the NES extremely well. Number 4. Rad Racer, Track 1. For lack of a better way of putting it, a very small handful of themes on the NES just made you feel cool while you were playing them. Rad Racer's main track of its 3 accomplishes that as well as any other on the system. It's surf rock at its best, with a healthy dose of that difficult-to-describe epic quality which I keep coming back to. It's one of the few tracks which was so good that you did not want to fail while it was playing, because every time you crashed the car, it reset. That meant that you couldn't get to the best part or that huge solo crescendo if you crashed the car a couple times during a race. Now, out of context, I've noticed this track isn't quite as good as when you have it framed with the sounds of the road and your engine humming beneath you at top speed. But when all those elements come together, it's difficult to beat. Number 3. Little Nemo, House of Toys. Now, I've gone on record as saying that Little Nemo is arguably the best soundtrack on the NES, track for track. And the more I think about it, it's not even that close. Literally every single track in this game is solid. Outside of Maniac Mansion, I don't think I can say that about any other game on the system whose soundtrack is more than just a couple of pieces. But it's the House of Toys theme that captures the spirit of its level and the game itself better than any other, making it my favorite from this musical juggernaut. Like I mentioned before, this theme brings back a flood of vivid memories of playing this game at a friend's house on a crisp summer night with the windows open as a kid. The pageantry of this track and the level are in perfect harmony as you feel like you're a child transported to a land of toys in your dreams, riding a shiny new early 1900s era toy train while marveling at the Christmas morning sights surrounding you, and while trying not to die, of course. To quote myself again, it begins with a bang, builds, crescendos, and takes you on a euphoric train ride of your own. It's like waking up on Christmas morning to a carnival within a fair within a parade. Truly magical stuff. I was just thinking about how huge this track would be if done properly by a full orchestra. So if anyone wants to get on that. Number 2. DuckTales, Moon Level. Another game inspired by a Disney afternoon cartoon classic, DuckTales is another solid platformer from Capcom. Most of the tracks in this game were decent enough, but it's the Moon Level which stands out for me as number 2 on this list of the best NES tracks of all time. From its opening spacey blips and the subsequent swells of that initial hook, you felt like you were embarking on a space odyssey 1,000 times bigger than the pixels before you were offering. This track is unique in that it's one of the few pieces on the NES where, as good as it is, you never hear the initial hook again. That's alright though, as the track gets even better after that as the main hook of the verse starts in. From there we go into a playful and jazzy chorus hook before the verse repeats, while those spacey blips and beeps remain throughout the track for a little ear candy. The bass line of the track is really what sells most of this. Very few tracks on the NES just go straight down the scale, but it frames the hooks in this one perfectly for the first quarter before hitting a sharp note outside of the scale and coming back up. The second half, rather than just recycling that same progression, music composer Hiroshige Tonomura puts a little spin on it to keep it fresh and really drive home the Odyssey-like scope feel of the track. There's not much else like it, and it's easily also one of the best tracks at capturing the feeling of its level's extraterrestrial setting. Before we unveil the top pick, let's take a look at some honorable mentions which didn't quite make the cut. Number 1. Mega Man 2, Bubble Man Stage. I can and will devote an entire top 10 list to the best Mega Man musics of all time at some point because those tracks are just that good. The first 4 Mega Man games alone are chock full of gems. I'm likely going to be killing the suspense with that list at some point by giving away now that number 1 on that list, just like this list, will still be Bubble Man Stage from Mega Man 2. Years before I began listening to actual popular music, video game soundtracks were the only music I cared about. I attribute my love of music in part to some of the first games I ever played, and I immediately connected with Bubble Man's music and knew it was something special from the very first time I heard it. Mega Man 2 is often cited as being the best in the series, and its soundtrack is a huge part of that. And while I think subsequent Mega Man games were arguably better track for track, Bubble Man stage music is the pinnacle of what the NES could do musically in my book, simple as it is. There's a beautiful melancholy from the first hook that you don't hear in too many other tracks on the NES, or games in general. Where most tracks and games were trying to psych you up or overload you with their epicness, Bubble Man's track catches you off guard with that initial hook. Another interesting bit to mention is that, as good as that opening hook is, much like DuckTales' Moon Level, it never comes back. It's one of the few pieces on the NES that makes you want to kill off your character just so that you can hear it again. All throughout the track are lovely rounded square waves playing arpeggiated parts that give you that feeling that you're underwater in the background, perfectly matching the setting of one of the better levels in Mega Man 2 as well. I've long said that water levels are, on average, some of the better tracks in video games. There's typically a wistful and more gentle nature to them, which helps them stand out among the rest of the game's score. It kind of makes me wonder if this is something which all game music composers equate with water levels, or if they're all just consciously or subconsciously following the lead of their predecessors or peers like Mega Man 2's composer, Takashi Tataishi. The chorus hook of Bubble Man's theme is played by a much sharper wave, with more of that bright high end coming through than the rest of the instruments in the track, and it consequently grabs your attention for its half laid back, half soaring melody. It's truly lovely. By the time we go back into that verse after the first post-chorus, it feels like a completely different part. And while it's really just a 35-second loop like practically every other track on the NES, it continues to feel original because of the dynamics of each preceding part. A very impressive accomplishment indeed, with the limited capabilities music composer Takashi had to work with in the NES. So there you have it. Those are my picks for the top 10 best individual tracks on the NES. Why not let me know exactly how wrong I am in the comment section below? And please don't forget to subscribe for more top 10 lists, live streams, let's plays, and of course fun times.